preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sidney Burgos, and I am Lectures Administrator here at the 92nd Street Y. Tonight, I welcome you to our lecture series about women. This series features inspirational women and topics related to issues facing women today. This evening, we have a very special guest, Maya Lin. She is an award-winning artist, architect, and has been recognized as one of the most gifted, creative geniuses of our age. Her latest book, Boundaries, documents all of her work to date. You can purchase a copy outside of the hall, and following the program, you'll also have the opportunity to have your copy signed by Ms. Lin. Our moderator for this evening is Lynn Gumpert. Ms. Gumpert is the director of the Gray Art Gallery at New York University. As director, she oversees the development of exhibitions, collections, and educational activities. Following the lecture, you'll have the opportunity to ask Ms. Lin and Ms. Gumpert any questions that you may have. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ms. Lynn Gumpert.
Good evening. It's almost impossible to be brief when introducing Maya Lin. She has, of course, won international acclaim for her site-specific art and architectural projects. As the critic Michael Brenson notes, from the moment she entered the national spotlight with her design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in 1981, she has proposed ways of thinking and imagining that resist categories, genres, and borders. Maya was born in Athens, Ohio in 1959. In 1986, she received her MA in architecture at Yale, where she also earned her BA. In addition to the Vietnam War Memorial, having won that national competition while she was still an undergraduate, her public sculptures include the Civil Rights Memorial at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, the Women's Table at Yale University, Groundswell at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, the Wave Field at the University of Michigan, and most recently, Reading a Garden for the Cleveland Public Library, a project she worked on with her brother, Tan Lin, a poet. Major architectural commissions include the Langston Hughes Library and Chapel for the Children's Defense Fund in Clinton, Tennessee, the Norton Residence in New York, and currently the Grayston Bakery for the Grayston Foundation in Yonkers. In New York City, she has designed the interior of the Museum for African Art in Soho, as well as the Asian Pacific American Studies Center at NYU. She has created public sculptures at the Rockefeller Foundation, the Federal Courthouse, and Penn Station. At the Gray Art Gallery, we were very pleased to host her solo exhibition, Topologies, which was organized by the Southeast Center for Contemporary Art, and which traveled to 4 other museums nationally. Other solo exhibitions of her art have been held at the American Academy in Rome and the Gagosian Gallery in Los Angeles. Currently, her exhibition, which is appropriately titled Between Art and Architecture, is on view through November 17th at the Arthur A. Houghton Jr. Gallery at the Cooper Union, where she also holds the Robert Gwathmey Chair in Art and Architecture this fall. In the catalog accompanying the Topologies exhibition, Michael Brenson wrote, Maya Lin is, at once, sculptor, architect, designer, craftsman, and thinker. Now we have to add writer. As Sidney noted, her book Boundaries, which was published by Simon Schuster, has just come out and does document all her work to date. Tonight, Maya will begin by showing some slides of work with which you may not be as familiar. After that, she and I will talk before opening the floor to questions. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Maya Lin.
Thank you, Lynn. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. As Lynn mentioned, I am going to run through a brief set of slides of work, a lot of which Lynn mentioned tonight, because I think one of the things is when you cross over into different fields, some might know you for the artwork, others might know you for the architectural work, others still in the general public might only know me for the memorial work, which is probably what led me to write the book Boundaries, because it's all about the crossovers and the interconnectedness between the work. But what I thought I'd start with first is purely visuals. I'll talk a little bit about it, and so if I could dim the lights, and maybe if the light on me could go down a little, that would help me out a little. Thank you. Student project, 1981, Vietnam Veterans Memorial. What can I say? A good quality education pays off. Went right back into graduate school, pretended it never happened, pursued my studies in architecture, started working back towards art. When I graduated, I moved to New York, completed an internship, and was contacted by the Southern Poverty Law Center to design a memorial for civil rights victims. And I was hesitant because, again, having had something so public, so large go out, I didn't want to be typecast, but at the same time I was very drawn to the knowledge that there hadn't been a national civil rights memorial, that as I started researching the history of that time, I was definitely aware that as a child I was never taught about the civil rights struggle. I was almost too young, even though it might be on the news, it never was dealt with, and I began to realize how important it is to keep history in focus, so we shouldn't forget, so of course we won't repeat the past. And so it is a water table, very asymmetrical, it's cantilevered, and on it are inscribed dates and events and legislative acts, all intertwined, starting with 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, ending with Martin Luther King's assassination in '68. It intertwines sometimes a person's death, other times a legislative event, and you begin to see as you walk around the table clockwise a timeline of history where often a person's death led to better legislation, or legislation led to a riot, so that you begin to see a causal effect. It was a people's movement, and one person could make a difference. And I wanted to get that message across, of which that talks about a set period in time, and I guess it's not. As you can see there is a gap on the timetable sort of signifying time before, time in the future, and the quote on the wall again signifies the struggle we still have. It's from Martin Luther King, quoting from the Book of Amos. The full quote is, "We are not satisfied, we shall not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." I hit that quote when I was reading about, researching about, I might take 2 to 3 months to research a project, and then I tend to shut that sort of learned, verbal, articulated process down, and usually I sketch something up very quickly. So it's this left side, right side of the brain, which happens in a lot of the work that I do. Anyway, that's the second of the series where about monuments, also about time. Keep in mind, the Vietnam Memorial begins and ends at the apex with 59, the beginning of the war, on the upper right-hand side, 75, the end of the war, at the bottom on the left. It's like an open book, but it's a closed timeline. It had a very definite time period. This one leaves it open. The next and last of the series is a piece I put in at Yale. The then president, Benno Schmidt, said, "Would you make a sculpture dedicated to women at Yale?" And I had no idea what that meant. I'd been there for 7 of those years. I think Yale officially went co-ed to undergraduates in '69, and so it would have marked the 20th anniversary, but as I started looking into it, there had been women at Yale from much, much earlier on. In fact, before they were officially enrolled, they were allowed to sit in on classes, and one professor called them, quote, "silent listeners." And it just sounded horrible. So, because you were you weren't counted, you weren't heard, so I thought I'd make a piece that counted women. So this one is a water table that is one piece, solid piece of stone that on the top, as you can tell, if I can get it to rewind, starts with zeros, names the dates, and about 1880, a little bit before then, the first group of women entered the Yale School of Art Street Hall because Mr. Street gave the money to build the hall under the condition his 2 daughters could go there. And then it counts the women up. And even though it factually represents the number of women specifically at Yale, what it also does is it marks the emergence of women working in society, women learning in society, beginning to, and you can see glitches where in World War II there's a huge jump because the men were at war, more women were allowed to enter. And I think I chose the idea of the numbers because when Yale went co-ed, the number of women allowed to enter was it was a quota system because there was a quote that Yale always had to allow 1,000 men to graduate so that women couldn't interfere. We could fill in the gap. And that quota was in effect from about 1969 for about 7 years, hotly contested. So again, my choice of counting women. This one obviously has a beginning, but no end. It's a spiral, which again draws into something that plays a lot in my work, time. So I'll talk a bit about a couple other projects. This one is in Long Island Railroad of Penn Station. It's a clock. The glass-lit disc with the numbers is fixed. The solid disc that you see on the left moves back and forth. It's accurate up to 15 minutes, and it pretty much talks about a solar eclipse, and it's in the subterranean level of Penn Station, so it sort of brings a naturally occurring phenomena downstairs. This is a piece that is literally just completed. You can see universal time coordinates, daylight savings time, Pacific Standard. It's for Stanford, California. And the ring is a second hand. The disc is a minute hand. The whole inner stone circle is rotating every hour. And then the whole sculpture is slowly rotating. It's about 11 tons of granite. It makes one complete rotation every year. So it's very extremely cantilevered. You can tell where the pivot point is that center circle. So in June, the sculpture's way over on this side, and on January, it's on the other side. And it sort of plays off of your idea of where you are in relation to time. This has been put in their computer science quad, where with the internet, what time is it really? And so it plays off this idea of universal time coordinates. So time is another theme that plays throughout my work, as well as text. And this is the sculpture I collaborate on with my brother, Ton, who's a language poet, where I've always used language, but I wondered what would happen if I asked a writer to come in. And I didn't just take a poem and slap it down on a table, but we interacted, where sometimes what he said changed what I was making, and vice versa. It's called Reading a Garden, and the centerpiece is a fountain, which it's spelled backwards, but it reflects forwards in the water, which gives you a clue that this piece is about the weight of words and the direction of words. It's a garden that you enter from 3 sides, and the poetry, language poetry, is almost an abstracted use of words, so it's non-narrative. So as you enter from 3 sides, you can make up your own poem through these words, of which the heart of it is the fountain that clues you into directions, and I can't seem to get this thing to click. There we go. And it's a child falls asleep, the bed is red and aquamarine. There's a bit of nonsense verse going on. The other side of the fountain, it's an L-shaped water wall that's flowing down with the words. It says, "You had a name. The name was shaped like origami in the fountain." And it's always about unfolding. But again, my brother and I played off of each other's shape and then the words, of which a prime example is, this is a table that just says verses run rhymes around reverse verses, run rhymes around reversed verses, run rhymes around reverse verses. He said it once, I tripled it, put it up like this, so of course the shadow is its reverse. So again, how do I begin to interact with the language in a built form? This is a piece I did, which is out of 43 tons of broken recycled car glass. It's for the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio. It was my first permanent artwork installation. And I think the other very strong underlying theme to my work is landscape. And I'm from the Midwest, and my parents are from China, and I'm very drawn to, like, I studied architecture in Japan for a summer. I'm very drawn to sort of non-Western aesthetics, the Zen gardens of Japan. So I wanted to blend the two distinctly in this piece. It's in 3 levels. The center level that you walk into is just a series of mounds. It's all gravity flow, so at the end of the school year they repoint it. This is what it's like in snow. And this is the lowest level, which was a fairly impossible site. It's a public cafeteria with an 8-foot concrete moat. And it's a Peter Eisenman building, and he sort of went, by combining 2 grids, had allowed residual spaces. So I just filled his spaces with this broken glass. The piece is called Groundswell, and it's as much about water as much as about sand, water, as well as sort of a Zen garden taken to a Midwestern siting. Where I grew up, there are these ancient Indian mounds, the Hopewell and Adena serpent mounds, the burial mounds. So I was sort of mixing the two ideas. And from that piece, I did another large-scale landscape work called Wave Field for University of Michigan. It's just sculpted earth, 10,000 square feet of it. And I put in a piece when I was resident at the American Academy in Rome. And since I don't ever want to recreate, each of these pieces is extremely unique. I was there for 2 months. They asked me to do an artwork. They have a beautiful interior courtyard, and they were about to fill it with more gravel. So I said, can I borrow that gravel for the 2 months? And so I shaped this piece with a bunch of volunteer students. The flow of a wheelbarrow formed the arc, and I created a little sea for them in their courtyard. And when I left, when the show came down, the kids went crazy over it and flattened it all out for me. And how do you bring these outdoor works where I'm basically excavating the earth inside when I'm asked to do an artwork for a building? How can I excavate a building, use it as my site? So this is called A Shift in a Stream for the Principal Financial in Des Moines, Iowa. Water's running throughout that channel, which is literally a break in the wall that you can walk right up to and put your hand in. All that water, this is the lowest level of a public plaza, or public lobby. And on the upper level, which is a 2-story high space, I merely created 13 water jets, or 14 water jets, and they randomly trickle water down. What I find, I'm very much inspired by natural landscape and phenomena, and it's very hard to recreate something that looks so simple and so stupid as rain running down a window. I mean, we must have spent months and months studying to make it look natural again. And that is, again, something I'm very, very much in love with, studying the natural landscape, natural phenomena, and trying to capture it in my artwork. This is one of the pieces that was at the Gray in the topology show. In the foreground, you have Untitled Topographic Landscape, which is made out of particle board. In the background, you have Avalanche, which is 11 tons of broken car glass. The Avalanche piece changed with every museum site. I kind of chose how to remake it. So at the Gray, it was up against the window, so you could actually see it. through the glass. And so again, it was my site-specific work, whereas all the rest were more static. This is, I wouldn't say static, because this is topographic landscape, which is just segments, and you can't tell if is it supposed to be sand, water, and again, I'm sort of fascinated with the play of fluid to solid masses. This is called Rock Field, which is 43 glass-blown shapes that are, again, inspired by the beauty of a natural stone and how asymmetrical they are and how hard they are to capture and imitate. This is called Phases of the Moon. Each wax disc gets steeper and steeper, and the shadow sort of begins to play out a lunar eclipse. This is from a series called The Geography Lesson, where I took a plate of tempered glass, inked it, broke it, and ran it through a press, which in a way recreates what a glacial cracking ice pattern looks like. But again, it also looks like a map of a state or a country. This was a smaller series called Flatlands. These were only 4 inches to 8 inches, whereas the ones before were 6 feet. Simultaneous to those artworks, I've also been working on architectural works, and so as I was doing the topology show, I was also launching a line of furniture for Knoll's 60th anniversary, which I entitled The Earth is, in parentheses, Not Flat, of which, if you think of a chair as a self-portrait for an architect, I did a line of furniture of which, what would the chair look like? I took my inspiration from non-Western design traditions, Chinese porcelain pillows, Ethiopian wooden headrests. I also wanted something that would be ambiguous. Is it sculpture? Is it design? Is it functional? Or is it something you just look at? And they're all concrete. And so the stools were called stones. In paralleling all this, I was working on the architecture, of which this is a piece of furniture for an apartment in New York, where you walk in and you see this. It's a puzzle piece, but it becomes a table. And the entire apartment transforms this way. It goes from being a 3-bedroom, 2-bath to a 2-bedroom, 1-bath. And it's all about, if architecture is about reflecting where we are in our period in time, I feel we live in a lot of ways more flexibly, how we come, how we go. Things aren't as stable in a way, so I wanted to play off of that and make an apartment that could transform, like origami or a transformer toy. This is the entrance as you come in. You come in, it's a duplex at mid-level. You can either go up to the private quarters or down to the public quarters. The whole kitchen hides away. It's built like a ship, the island, the dining room table you saw. So the wall of the kitchen is, of course, the ovens. The bathroom either is a large upstairs bathroom or 2 smaller ones if you shut that screen door. Even the bathtub was custom made, the concrete. See that slit on the right-hand side is the drain or the overflow. And the back wall hides all the shower head equipment. You can swing it out. So everything's hidden. So there's the other bathroom, which would be normally very small if it had a shower, unless you tuck it away when it's not in use. So it was all about slight transformations. It was almost like giving someone a manual to use it. Is it a piece of architecture? Is it a little bit of a toy? And then another building I was working on was for the Children's Defense Fund in Haley, Tennessee. This is the Langston Hughes Library. I fell in love with this old 1870s cantilever barn and decided to save it, to recycle it. It was on the premises. Marion Wright Edelman had called me down to do a library and to also design a chapel, so I figured I would work in one old and one new. So this is the old one. And I left the old untouched on the outside and just skinned it with a modern layer on the inside. This is sort of the plan of it. On the lower end, you see the entrance crib. The entrance crib is on the left. The gift store is on the right. And it's small. It's only 2,000 square feet, just like the apartment before. And so I wanted to utilize that outdoor courtyard as the first room. So I placed a sculpture at that point. So as you come in, even though that's like a 7-foot high space, it becomes your entryway into the building. And there's a sculpture, kind of creating an outdoor room. And then I just sawed away at the old building and then slipped a new skin in. And that's sort of looking from the entrance back to the gift store. And going up, where the shadow lights of the crib are sort of played within the lighting I introduced. And then I maximized daylighting, used regional and recycled materials on the inside. We used the nearby pond as a natural heat sink for energy efficiency, which is something I'm very... And again, the skins of the maple, the glass, all kind of wrap around and unfold upstairs. And the whole barn overlooks a pond. And this pond is also, the chapel will face this pond as well. You can see in this site plan on the far upper right will be the chapel, also overlooking the pond. And I'm taking it from the motto of the Children's Defense Fund. Dear Lord, be good to me. The sea is so wide and my boat is so small. So I envisioned a barn, but a barn like a boat. And I started building up a boat shape. And the boat simplified so that you'll have a terrace in between, a stone seminary room and offices, an underground connection, an outdoor terrace that can take, twice a year they have very large crowds, but the rest of the time it's very small. I didn't want to overpower the site. So you'll have the wooden barn, and for those occasions twice a year, the terrace can be used and tented over with roller furlings. And in a way, the geometry of the terrace will have the apple orchard behind it kind of work with it. So the outdoor space is almost more a part of the trees than building. That's sort of how it looks. And I'm going to end there and open it up to a discussion and questions.
Thank you, Maya. I thought we'd start our discussion with the book. I was impressed with the importance you attached to writing as part of your creative process. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I think oftentimes I start with a sketch. I called the book a visual verbal sketchbook, and oftentimes I'll write about a work before I actually start trying to make a model of it or trying to sketch it. I think especially for the more loaded projects like the memorials, I might have spent 3 to 6 months researching, deliberately not wanting to make a model, because I almost, sometimes if you jump to the form too soon, I think I said, I want to think of an idea without a shape, because other times you might have a shape and then you have to stuff all sort of meaning into it. And for me, I'd rather, what I tend to do is I just read and read and read and read, and I never quite know when it's going to come. And then sometimes I put it away for a while, and then I'll wake up one morning and make a model. And that's generally it.
The title, of course, is Boundaries, and you state very clearly as soon as you open the book that you feel that you exist on the boundaries. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's sort of, it's funny, I sort of wrote the book and ended up, I had written little essays throughout, and it was between art and architecture, between science and art, between an analytic paired with a very intuitive process, between East and West. And I found myself, between art and architecture, always bridging between things. And I think boundaries is, again, an ambiguous word, and you think it means division. And all I'm asking is, think about the line between places. Think of that dividing line as a physical place with dimension, just for once. As opposed to thinking of the space on either side, think of that middle ground. I'm drawn to it, and I don't know why. Obviously, I think in the book I explore my background from Ohio, but not quite fitting in. But I also think, my mother was very much bookish. My father was a potter. And again, I probably inherited both the left side, right side of the brain. And I think that plays off in most everything I do.
In your book, there's a really nice passage or a chapter devoted to the influence of your father.
Right. I talk about, it's almost like a naive situation in that you don't really realize, and I would hope you can't try to sit back and go, okay, why do I do what I do? But it was a bit of an epiphany when I was like, I talk about it, and it's probably the only time I have talked about it, but it meant so much to me. My dad was a potter, then he became Dean of Fine Arts, and he started out in China as an administrator, but when he came to the States, he didn't think they would accept him that way. So he went into art in his mid-40s, and he started making these amazing pots. Like I remember as a child, he would pull a pot that would be as long as his arm. And if anyone is potted, I can't pot to save my life. He gave up on me when I was about 8. But what's strange is it never occurred to me that all my early models, all my architectural projects, I made out of clay or plasticine. And I didn't even realize that my professors thought I was a little eccentric. It just never occurred to me because I was brought up modeling clay. I was modeling the earth. And so it's like, what I was trying to point out, I think, was how certain things seem so obvious, and yet they're so close to you, you don't know. And it wasn't until I saw his hands, and it was like, duh, it was just so obvious.
Okay.
But it was also very personal, that I feel like this incredible attachment to sort of the gift that he gave me, the aesthetic gift.
And I understand that he made or helped design the house that...
Yeah, I mean, basically, you wonder, where is your cultural aesthetic coming from? Is it genetic? Is it whatever? And I basically assume they had a very certain way of living, and everything from the bowls we ate on to the furniture he built to the house he chose for us to live in was coming out of somewhere. I couldn't figure out, because we're Chinese and it seemed more Japanese. And then I went to visit the summer home of his family in Fujian, and it was a Japanese-style house. Now, the Chinese regional architecture and the Japanese aren't that far, but in a way, I then found out that his mother, who I had no pictures of because of the, all memory erased, had loved Japanese architecture and had asked that this house be built on the river.
How old were you? Yeah.
This was in 84, 85. I had just studied in Japan and went into China with my mother and my brother, and we're walking around the ruins of the old house, and I'm just taking pictures because I'm realizing I get it. I can see the connection. So to me, it is something that is passed down generationally, depending upon how you're brought up in that sense. I don't think you're born with it. But I think they definitely, the visual and aesthetic passovers were definitely there.
It seems clear that they definitely were.
Yeah.
You've also, in talking about your work, mentioned how important the concept concept of time is, and how it resurfaces or is a leitmotif that comes and goes in all your work. I was struck by the way in which the book is organized into 12 chapters that are indicated 0,
1
0,
o'clock,
0, that
2 o'clock,
yes.
3 o'clock, 4
I
o'clock.
take it that wasn't a coincidence.
No, it was, that was where, in putting the book together, I did a deliberate, again, it's a crossover. I went with Simon Schuster, who one might not normally think of as an art book, and then I brought in a book designer, Michael Rock of 2x4, who basically lives in the artist architecture book world. I chose a size of a book that would deliberately be ambiguous. It's almost too small for a coffee table, but a little too large for a textbook. Again, and I watched as Michael and my editor, Bill Rosen from Simon & Schuster, at times it was very interesting, like oil and water, because you had two worlds that hadn't really worked together before, trying to, like, one's coming from a very high-end design world, one's coming from a very solid publishing world, and they don't quite know how, and I'm watching this happen in the book, but I think things started to happen as the book got structured, about the time where Michael was definitely taking my love of time and playing it off, of which the time periods separate chapters, and then every now and again there's a very specific date mentioned, like a certain date, 1982, when I actually entered the Vietnam Memorial Competition. Civil rights is dated the same way. So sometimes the time becomes very specific, and then it goes back into the more general, more like a page number, but again, playing off of time. And I even talk about it in the end, because it's something that people used to say, well, you know, the Vietnam Memorial is such a large piece, like, how are you ever going to overcome it? And I kept thinking, well, we could just pretend to reverse it, pretend it's my last piece, and then do a build-up. You know, and so I do that. At the beginning, you see all the artworks in About the Work going from the Vietnam to my latest work, and in the end chapters, before I talk about the last memorial, I reverse the time sequence and I talk about that because I think it is probably one key reason why I wrote this book rather than doing a straight-out, say, architectural book, because there was something I wanted to talk about, which is overcoming doing something at the age of 21. And it will be, by its very nature, the two memorials, especially Vietnam, are very public, very loaded, and how do you, as an artist, not compete with that and move on? And so I kind of wanted to bring that out.
Yeah, I can imagine that overcoming that initial first work / monumental sculpture was quite something. You do mention in the book that, I mean, you work a lot. I mean, you're always busy, and that has something to do with the fact of trying to respond or move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a very small staff. Right now, I have maybe 2 or 3 assistants. Always, I've got trained visual artists working with me, and I have trained architects working with me. For most of the body of the work that I talk about in the book, I might have had 1, maybe 2 assistants. So one could say that I've been a little overachievement oriented. I'm trying to slow down now, but I needed to prove something, and I think I also, because I wanted to prove in both art and architecture that I was serious about both, I think we live in an age of specialization. I think it started with the industrial movement. I think up until 10 years ago in my education, I was point blank told in architecture school, Maya, you've got to make a choice. It's either art or architecture, but you can't do both. That has since completely been switched off. If you go into schools today, there's talk about interdisciplinary, there's talk about crossover, there's talk about those that do both. But 15 years ago, it was considered, well, you certainly aren't going to be serious about either if you try to balance the two. And, you know, I don't think it's conscious choice. I love both. They're very different from me. And I didn't have a choice. So, but it was not, it was seen as being, well, you're going to be a dilettante, or you're going to, and in a way, I can only do so many architectural projects. And I'm not out to have a large firm. I mean, when people say office, I wince. It's a studio. I'm an artist. I happen to build buildings. I team up with licensed architects, engineers, whoever I need. Like for the bakery project, we're working with bakery, food, specialty architects, only because that allows me to maintain aesthetic control but not become
too specialized.
Well, an office in a way. I kind of
Right.
like staying small. But yeah, it's kept me busy, and I'm actually going to finish up some architectural projects and then go back into my studio.
Well, you also talk in the book about the fact that the monuments are very much hybrids between
Right.
sculpture and between architecture. They're sculptures that have a specific function. And in all your work, there's been this dialogue, or a lot of your work, especially the public work,
Right.
there's the dialogue between the public and the private.
Right.
What's really strong is the intimacy and the one-on-one relationship that you can get in these big public pieces. How does it feel to go back and work in the studio when you don't have to have that kind of...
It's actually probably more difficult for me because I mean, the assumption is, oh, you're an artist, you get to do whatever you want to do. It's actually much harder to go into your studio and do whatever you want to do. It's almost easier to be given a set of issues, a set of functions, a set of problems. Once you walk into the black box, so to speak, and you can do whatever you want to do, sometimes you just hit a wall and you just don't know. I mean, it took me, when I started, there were works that led up to Groundswell that were earlier earthworks after the Vietnam, and they might not be my strongest works, but you can see the progression. And then, of course, for me, Groundswell and Wavefield, I'm in love with what I'm doing there. So I'm now in art definitely exploring how I deal with natural landscapes, natural topography and topology. So it's a little easier. But when you start, even the Vietnam Memorial is an earthwork, but I didn't at that point say, okay, my work is going to... It's a real exploration, and you don't know where you're going to end up, and it's a real searching process. So unfortunately or fortunately, each of these works has been very public, so it's like my growth has sort of been a little bit more out there at times. But then I can just disappear into my studio, which I actually fully intend to do, after this whole...
finishing up your projects that are already
I kind of work in
commissioned.
phases, and then I'll go back into my studio.
Well, I can relate to the idea that it's much more difficult to go into your studio without any specific assignment. I've always likened that, or see my admiration for poets and fiction writers in the same way. If I'm given an assignment, I can write about it. But if I have to go, I can't imagine sitting down and starting to write.
Yeah, right. That would be the hardest thing,
Yes.
which I could never do. I would never even attempt to do. I mean, that's one thing about this book. When I did it, it was extremely nerve-wracking because I wrote it not because I thought I was a writer. It's just that writing is a material element of my work. I think of it like I would think of glass or stone, or like a painter would think of paint. I use it. It's a tool, and I needed to document it in that fashion. So I use words sometimes as image, and then other times images become the words. There's very little text on a page.
Well, what I enjoyed also personally about the book was the fact that, like the apartment you designed, it's a bit of a surprise and a puzzle at times. Right. You play a lot with scale, which I think you do in your architecture as well, and in your art. You play a lot with short chapters, long chapters, thoughts that flow, and it seems to make perfect sense, especially the fact that the writing does, you, as a reader, you're brought along with the process in which you yourself make the work, which is not an easy task.
Yeah, I know, it's an odd one. I think, I still wonder, why did I do this book?
Yeah, why did you write the book?
I think after the documentary came out, and I looked at it, and I was sort of embarrassed when it came out. I sort of never told any of my friends, and then I figured it was a very educational situation. I realized that I have been interviewed, and I've existed in articles, but never as an artist. As an artist, you really kind of want to document your process, and it's sort of like what Robert Smithson did in a lot of his earlier essays. And so when I saw the documentary, I realized I needed to kind of pull it together for myself as an artist. Because, I mean, certainly if an artist had gone in and made like an art documentary, it certainly wouldn't have won the Academy Award. It would have been a very different creature. So this is one that really was, again, much more public, much more open that way. But I also realized that, you know, I didn't talk really about my making of artworks, and I almost winced a little bit. I'm going, oh, I talked about its height in relation to my shortness. It was, oh, what am I doing? And so I thought, this really isn't how I think about my work, and I really wanted to convey that.
I'm going to ask one last question and then open it up to the audience, who I'm sure have questions as well. The images in the book seem to be part of your working process as well. How do you keep a library of images?
Oh God, no. You'll notice a lot of the images earlier on could be even a little grainy at times. Some of them are directly pulled from the video. This idea of that sometimes I don't believe you can convey an experiential work in a still photograph. So the idea of pulling from a video still with the essays was my way of saying that's how you sometimes best experience these works. A lot of the earlier photographs are my photographs, basically because, again, and it's very interesting, except for the architectural works, all the architectural shots are very professional, beautifully done, but I actually find a lot of times that I prefer the shots I take of my sculptures, because it's almost part of the process. It's like I see them in a way that I don't want them to slick or it's something or other. And so even there's a detail shot. There are actually two of the Vietnam Memorial, one in snow and one of a detail of the names that I actually took a long time ago. And we're talking very chewed up slides. I'm famous for not taking care of my slides.
Editor and designer very happy.
They were really shocked. Michael Rock was going, oh, you know, where are the 4x5s? I'm going, oh, they're just 35 millimeters. But that we seem to be okay with them.
Resolve that. The other ones, though, are the research photos that you take as inspiration for some of the works?
Yeah. I basically, like, the wave field actually came about because I went in and I started reading. It's for an aerospace engineering building, and I started reading about flight because that is what is taught there. And I maybe spent 2 to 3 months talking to scientists, talking to the teachers, and then one of the scientists sent me this book. It was Van Dyck's Album of Fluid Motion, and in order to flight, you have to have air turbulence and resistance. That's really simplifying the turnover for me saying that. And so when you start looking into resistance and turbulence, you start looking at fluid dynamics. And I hit this one photographic image of a naturally occurring water wave, and I knew that's what the piece was. And this is maybe fishing for 3 to 4 to 5 months, and I fish. And I'll often when I'm working with scientists, I will go in and I will say, look, everything I'm going to ask you, none of it's going to show up in the piece, because they tend to think of things very literally, and so I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea when I go jumping down this rabbit hole or that one, and then it's up for grabs as to what actually ends up in the piece.
Okay, I guess we can take questions from the audience. The gentleman in the front.
Ms. Lynn, first I want to say that I think your design for the Vietnam Memorial was the perfect tribute to the soldiers who died in that war. And I'd like to know, did you get any negative reactions from people who objected to an Asian American?
Only before it was erected. It was one of those amazing things where I was so young, and I think if you remember when we're all so young and we don't have an ounce of fear or doubt in us, it's probably what kept me alive in Washington. I never once even thought about whether it wouldn't work. I was just, oh, it's going to help people. I'm going to do something that makes people feel, I mean, I sort of designed it psychologically as something that would be cathartic. I mean, up until it was built, the veterans, I was again very naive about my race. And at the very first press conference, some reporter said, well, don't you think it's ironic that the war was fought in Asia and you're of Asian descent? And I just looked at him. And I said, well, I'm from Ohio. And it's absolutely irrelevant. It took me 9 months in Washington before I kind of asked the veterans, well, have there been any letters about my race? And they all, I mean, we had a very interesting time building it. I had hair down to my knees. They saw me as the 60s radical. I was just, my dad liked long hair. I was like your duteous little girl, whatever, who kept her hair long. But they had a very different impression of me. I think they thought I was coming out of a different generation. So we were not quite seeing eye to eye. But what was really sweet is, even though we were disagreeing at times, they were trying to protect me the whole time. Because yes, indeed, of course, there were criticisms and comments and about a gook designing the memorial, which I was happily naive for most of the time that I was in Washington. The question I always say is, once it was built, didn't hear a peep. Apparently Secretary of the Interior Watt would go visit it under construction, and apparently he told a Park Service person, I kind of like this piece. But it was too late. They had all spoken. They had all committed to compromises. The wheels were in motion. People had said what they were going to say. Actually, since it was built, I haven't had one negative situation, one negative letter. And but what can you do?
Thank you so much for all your pieces. I find with your pieces, compared to perhaps other art or sculptures, that there's such a strong participatory element. You feel very connected
Right.
to the pieces in a way that I feel. And my question is, it doesn't sound like you imagine that experience in your creative process, but
Well,
as a result.
I actually think whenever I make a work, I'm only thinking about how one person is going to experience it. I also think there's some key things that I do very much do. You'll notice that on all the memorials, the text is very small. How large do you think the text on the Vietnam Memorial is? An inch high? An inch? It's less than half an inch high. Now, it was unheard of at that time. You think monument, you think billboard. You have to read your text the way you read a billboard. And that's how we read in a public space. What if you put a book out in a public arena? You're going to read it the way you read a book in private, one-on-one, and very intimately. And I think even in the book being this scale, and then it's sort of like the text is compression, and then it goes to long paragraphs, then it goes short. It's all about a very personal one-on-one connection. And I think all I think about is I basically am fairly stupid that way. I don't think about how, like people said, oh my God, your piece is in the middle of Penn Station, or your piece is in Constitution Avenue. I can only think about how one person is going to react to the work. So then I don't get intimidated by thinking about a large group reading. So it's completely a part of my process. And I think that's my architectural training. When I was learning about architecture, it was still sort of the end of the 60s teaching, and there was a book called Experiencing Architecture by Rasmussen, which talks about the psychology of spaces. I was trained by Vincent Scully, who again talked about the meaning of space in relation to a personal experience, which is not very theoretical, but again, it was much more the training I had, that we think about how we relate to things in a much more psychological or empathetic way rather than a learned or theoretically based way.
Do you have any comment to make about the proposed World War II memorial in Washington?
You know, all I've seen is a picture about this big. I've heard from a lot of people I trust that the sighting is something to be looked at again. I can't comment because I really have not really looked at it, but it is a very, very tricky spot, and I think they have to be extremely careful how they're going to introduce anything there, if at all, you know, but again, I haven't really looked at it.
Curious if listening to music plays any role in your creative process?
Unfortunately, I do listen to music all the time. I'm not trained. I was never, that was one of the art forms I did not get exposed to as a child by choice. My parents were both brought up in China. My dad was doing calligraphy day in and day out, and he swore if he ever had kids, he'd never force them to do anything that they didn't want to do. And as a result, I didn't learn Chinese, and I never picked up anything more than a recorder. I think there's been a lot of talk about the connection between music and architecture and how you experience a situation through time. It's completely, I just listen. I'm actually fairly ignorant when it comes to the specifics.
What contemporary architects do you admire?
Ooh, tough one to say. I'm going to start with a few that aren't so contemporary because I'm just going to talk about those that have made sort of a lasting impression. Generally speaking, Japanese architecture, Shaker design, Louise Barragan, Louis Kahn, Frank Gehry. I think there is a lot of interesting work right now coming out of Europe. Wheel Eretz, Ben Van Berkel. I think Diller and Scafidio is someone I'm looking at. They're working on something for JFK. It's a range. I think probably more influential to me have been the artists that have come out of the 60s and 70s, Robert Smithson, Richard Serra. I just got back from Jim Terrell, his building a Rodin Crater out in Arizona, which is incredible. So I would probably say the earth artists of the 70s, when they stepped out of the gallery and went out into the wilderness to build works, have been extremely influential on me.
On my first visit to the Vietnam Memorial, there was a tour guide who was explaining some of the symbolism, which I found fascinating. I would love to hear your description of the symbolism behind it.
Like, for instance, what?
Well, one of the things was the polished surface, so that when the viewer looked at it, you saw yourself
Right.
reflected in it.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Experience those kinds of
that sort of thing. It's a fairly long explanation. There was an incredible process I went through to make that piece, which I actually, wrote about. I think I hesitate to talk about it here because I don't tend to talk about that one piece that way. It's just sort of, it's almost like it would take, I could do a whole hour-long piece on it, frankly.
You can read about it in the book. And I'll tell you that it has something to do with mashed potatoes.
No, it's,
Maya,
yeah.
of your work, the one piece that seems to perhaps not fit into the same category as many of your art pieces is, in fact, the Anastasia.
No, it's a hybrid. It's a hybrid piece, just like the monuments are hybrids. It's half art and half architecture. It's art in that it brings a natural phenomena into an interior architectural space, but it is built into the architecture, so it's almost architectonic in vocabulary. So I consider it a hybrid. It's one of the, it merges art and architecture. And you're right, it is formalistically almost talking more in an architectural vein. And so I've always sort of put that into more of the monuments, which again, the monuments and that piece and the Stanford timetable piece deal with time. And it's something that is, I keep going back to, and I, again, don't know why, but I'm very drawn to time in these more formal works.
Getting back to your influences, I'm just curious if Jenny Holzer has reviewed.
Not really, because she was sort of doing text when I was, you know, the Vietnam Memorial came out, and I've always been intrigued with text. I mean, I admire her work, I like her work, but it's sort of like, you know, I've just never, formally, I just have never thought of it as the same way as the way Smithson has been incredibly powerful and moving to me.
I think actually what's interesting is the fact that Jenny started her first text pieces in public spaces in the early 80s, 81, 82, and it was just one of those coincidental things where text, and you look at the role of language in 20th century art, the history of 20th century art, and you'll see it become gradually more and more and more important. And I think a number of artists like Maya and Jenny have just tapped into that for very different reasons. But as Maya said also, it's, for her, language is a medium. It's like the
right.
glass
Also,
or whatever.
The main difference, I think, is that Barbara Kruger, Jenny Holzer, they are creating, or their voice is out there. You'll notice that, see, I had to wait for a site like the Cleveland Public Library to collaborate with the writer. I didn't want to write. I wanted to bring in a writer to work with me on that one. And so in all the pieces, like the numbers for Yale, the factual histories, everything's very much about fact, and then I'll work with it, but I actually won't want to go out and make statements out there. I'm actually almost the antithesis of that.
Well, you talk about the fact that you want to present the facts and let people make up their own mind.
Right, and that's how I use it. It's a little more, I mean, my personality is out there, but it's not my voice in that sense. I mean, obviously nothing in history is objective. So whatever I do, I'm framing it and telling it, and that is, but it's not going to be as direct as what Kruger or Holzer are doing.
Well, it's interesting in the fact that Kruger and Holzer are also working, you know, between writing and visual arts, whereas
Right.
yours is coming from that other kind of architectural art hybridity that uses language as one way of inserting, it seems like, the content or the specificity that can bounce then off of other issues that you're dealing with.
Right. No, it's almost like, yeah, I mean, they're coming out of also like what other political artists have done. And yes, the work that I do tends to be with the memorials very, very political, but not ever is my voice coming out there. I prefer to use historians. I almost prefer to really stick to a much more non-personal, non-individualized use of the language, which allows you to interpret for yourself in a different way.
Can you talk a little bit about gender, your gender influencing?
I think Lynn should probably I'm very hesitant to, again, in writing this book, it's like, how do you write a book and not become sort of like self-critical or theorizing about it? I am very hesitant to want to discuss my work in relation to my gender, because I almost would prefer if others would add their critical eye to it. Because I'm not, in my work, I don't try to make my work gender, like I'm not I don't see myself as, say, a feminist art. Therefore, it doesn't become an object of my work. At which point, I'd leave it up to others to take a look and say.
Why don't you just say a few words about your mother and the fact that she was a writer and a poet?
Well, I think they were more interested in the whole gender. The play
But
of gender.
in your book, you talk about the fact that your mom was always working, your dad was always working. It was a question that you would always work,
Right.
that there wasn't any...
I was brought up fairly, girls could do whatever they wanted to do. I never even questioned that I couldn't be doing exactly. And I think I was brought up in a very unusual situation where my father didn't favor the son over the daughter. I mean, there wasn't as much of a gender playoff in the family, and I think it's probably helped me survive in certain areas. I think when I first started working in the 80s, I remember we interviewed a lot of architects of record for the Vietnam Memorial, and there was a major power play going on with the competition advisor at the time. In fact, he was trying to become the architect of record. And there got to be some very tense, awkward moments, and some of the contractors didn't quite know how to deal with me. I was 21. I looked very, very young. I did have hair down to my knees. And so one of the groups that was very cute brought out milk and a plate of cookies. And I knew they weren't going to get the job. Obviously, I think it is extremely hard, especially in architecture. I think my sensibility is there are a lot of women that study architecture. It's almost 50-50. But those that end up becoming the hot lead designers within firms, it's still incredibly subjective, and it's still incredibly tough. I don't think it's, I just look at it and go, oh, things haven't changed that much. I mean, it's more like it's a comfort level. It's also like, I think, you have CEOs, and they're going to bank $100 million or $1 billion on someone, and they're of a certain ilk, and they're of a certain generation. They feel more confident with others. That will change in time. I mean, I've actually been brought in on many projects where the woman was the director of the museum or something. I think it's slower than I thought it would be happening, but again, it doesn't bother me. I just try. I mean, it's funny. I will walk into a room, and I used to be the only woman in a team, and it's slowly changing. But it is changing, I think. Not really. I actually, when I first did it, I just figured, oh, well, it's time to get back to where I wanted to go. I went right back into school because that's exactly what I wanted to do. In fact, I stayed there for 3 more, I didn't surface again until '86. And by then, enough of the flack had sort of died down, and I was quietly doing my internship. As an artist, I don't think you're ever in competition with anyone but yourself in a weird sort of a way. And you're trying to push yourself to the next place. Once you finish a project, it's gone. Or at least for me it is. There's an emotional cutoff, and you have to be as engaged in the next piece. As far as the difficulty of always being known as like, the equivalent would be a child star, actress, whatever. Obviously that was like a little worrisome, but I feel like in a way this book is about that. The book chronicles 10 years of work, really, from '89 to '99. I was basically in school, and there are only 2 student projects in that book. Take a look. I feel pretty comfortable with where I'm going. I mean, I'm still young, I think, architecturally, because I do the artwork, but I got to a point where For me, it was more a fear, if I'm pursuing both art and architecture, I don't want to be schizophrenic. Okay, I don't want the two to merge. In other words, I don't want my buildings looking like wave. I didn't want to be that gestural in the architecture, but I wanted them to be a shared aesthetic, and that was very, very important. So I think, from an artist's point of view, you're competing with yourself, if anything. And yes, it's hypercritical, but the criticism is from within. Oh, God, that's a hard one. I mean, one of my favorite pieces of all time was Tilted Arc. And I really loved it. And I didn't think it was brutal. I thought it was actually a very beautiful lyrical piece, I think. In fact, I taught a course on its removal because I was so fascinated by it. There are a lot of different readings and misreadings of it. It's whatever one's opinion is. But that was one of my favorite pieces. Of course.
The question was whether or not Maya felt that, given the notoriety of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, if the opportunities that presented themselves would have been different had you not won that competition or done that piece.
Of course, every time you take a step in one direction, whether you're going to meet this person or that person, that one's a big one. But in a weird way, I'll give you a story. I got out of graduate school. I came to New York with a bunch of friends who were all from the Yale School of Art, and we're all sitting around the table with some artists in New York. And I don't know how the conversation came up, but basically it was about whether the memorial was a work of art and whether I was an artist. And this one older artist said, "No, you're not an artist. That's not a work of art." Now, we're sitting around the table with everyone who's just gotten out of graduate school. They all can call themselves artists. I wasn't allowed to. It took me another 10 years before I was seen as an artist. Maybe it'll take me another 5 before enough architecture is out. So yes, there have been pluses and minuses with getting that thing out there, but it could have easily been the sort of the red is, oh, that's what she did. Also, I had to I did 2, and then I said, okay, I'm doing 2 memorials, retiring. Then I had to prove myself in 2 fields I wasn't connected with. That was tough.
What brings you the greatest satisfaction in the work? Or the source of your joy?
I guess the process of making it and discovering what I want to do, and then there's nothing more than seeing it and seeing that it's translated from the mind's eye out into the public, and it's sort of what you thought you were. I mean, it's sort of like there's something very magical about taking something from within your imagination and then making it real. I think for me right now, though, the greatest joy is a balancing between making the work and then I have 2 young kids, and just the ability to balance it and sort of try to keep it all in flow. Maybe one more question?
In your exhibit at Cooper Union, there's the powerful silver.
Right.
And that's, as I looked at that, I just kept wondering what your process was and how that was the same and how it was different from other projects.
The question is, at the exhibition at the Cooper Union now, there's 2, well, you consider it 1 artwork or 2 artworks?
It's 2 artworks. Well, it's actually, it's a pairing, but yeah, they're 2 artworks. I was asked by a foundry, could I work with precious metals, as in gold and silver? Now, the trouble is when you're making a sculpture, there was a limit in the backing as to how large the piece of gold could actually be. None of the other artists in the show, in the end, chose to work in gold. Everyone chose to work in silver because, again, how can you make a sculpture that people are going to relate to as a sculpture and not as a piece of jewelry? And so I started thinking about not consciously making a form, which led me to a drop or a splatter or a plop of metal, of molten metal. So there's a drop of silver, which is about this big, that is it looks like a simple viscous drop of water. And then the puddle of gold is literally a puddle of gold. Months and months and months of making plops, puddles, drops. Again, trying to capture something that looks completely random, completely natural, but also works, that doesn't look premeditated. And again, it's that nature is incredibly complex, what we accept, that simple river-worn pebble, which looks so simple, is one of the most complex shapes that you're ever going to come across. Look at it again. Yeah, I hope so. Oh, we had more fun than anything. In fact, when Bob Rindler, the dean of art at Cooper Union, came in, that's what he saw. He saw a table of nothing but these plops. And he's like, this is great. So the whole point of the Cooper Union show is it's all process, because it's for students to give people insight. And as you walk down one aisle, you have all these models of the bakery going up. And directly on the other side, you have the artwork. And it's all about balancing the left side and the right side of the brain, the art, the architecture, and you're kind of going, how does she go from switching from one to the other? That's the game.
And that shows up till November 17th. And as Maya told me just before we started the conversation, it's going to change over time too. And it is about the process, and it is about the way in which, essentially, she just took her studio and moved it over to Cooper Union.
Which the bakery, we're still using some of the models, so one of them's
sometimes
being
they go
borrowed,
away too.
And then some will come back.
Thank you, Maya.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.